Okay. Welcome to our intercultural dialogue. My name is Valeria, and I'm going to be the mediator of this chat. It's next slide. Okay. First step is, who are you? Please explain to our audience who you are and what is your position in this dialogue involving the autonomy of the EZLN shells, and what do you think that they represent? Please, we'll start with Mexican state.
Wonderful. I'm June, representing the Mexican state. As it said on the slide here, the Mexican state, Mexico is a republic and a representative and democratic republic made up of free states united by a federal pact, the Constitution. Unfortunately, historically, as a continuation of the of colonization, Indigenous peoples in Mexico haven't been able to experience Mexico as a representative and democratic republic. And I am hoping that through this intercultural dialogue that we will be able to find ways to make reparations for those past harms, understanding that they can't be repaired, but hopefully we can use this intercultural dialogue to move into a future where they can experience Mexico as a representative and democratic place. That's my introduction. Oh, sorry, one final thing. And the other part of that is the Mexican government would ideally be taking a back seat in this dialogue, because the Mexican government is wanting to see that moving forwards, the self-determination of Indigenous peoples takes a front seat of this process. So that's my introduction and my proposal. Handing over to the Indigenous Mayan communities next.
Please continue the Indigenous communities.
Okay, Octavio and I were representative of indigenous communities. We are two representatives of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZLN, knowing and living the inequalities suffered by the indigenous people of the Mexican nation. I please expand before this audience the continuous struggles that the Zapatista Army carries out. The Zapatista movement was born out of demands of the indigenous communities in Chiapas for work, land, housing, food, health, education, independence, justice, and peace. We simply want to prevail and see justice done in the San Andres Agreement.
Thank you. Please continue the international organization, in this case, the UN.
Good evening, I'm Mateos. I'm representing the United Nations, and we are an international organization that was in 1945 to promote peace, security, and cooperation amongst our member countries, which Mexico qualifies for. We are not directly involved in dialogue because we're an international organization. However, we stand for the autonomy of the EZLN and the Zapatistas conflict, and we support the principles of autonomy and self-determination, which are fundamental human rights recognized by the UN, and we believe that all people have the right to govern themselves according to their own ways of life and tradition. So that's very much in line to what my counterparts from the indigenous communities have just elaborated on.
Thanks. Now, to every single one of the parts involved, I want to make a really important question about the Larrañaga agreements in the 19th century. Sorry, in the 20th century. What areas of opportunity did you observe in the Larrañaga agreements? What can be changed in your perspective, and what should be kept in the perspective as well? I'll start, please, with the Mexican state.
I think there are huge amounts of opportunity in the Larrañaga agreements, and what needs to be changed historically is less about the agreement itself and more about how the Mexican government goes about implementing or not implementing the agreement. As we've seen over the last many years, the Mexican state's implementation of the terms of the agreement have been lackluster at best. there's some things that have been technically introduced from the agreement but not actually followed through on in legal frameworks, and the way that those things are funded and implemented. Sorry. And there are other parts that just haven't been implemented at all. There's also the example of the Maya train as a current example of the way that the Mexican state is damaging self-determination and autonomy in ways that are an attempt at sneakily going around things like the agreement by saying like, oh, it's just a train for tourists, but not taking into account the views of the peoples whose land that is. So from the Mexican state's perspective, I don't think I would be comfortable saying what could be changed about the actual agreement. I don't think it's the Mexican state's place, but I think it is the Mexican state's place to say what can be changed is the actual implementation of the agreement in line with how the agreement was made and in good faith. And again, as for what should be kept in line with self-determination and autonomy, I would leave that to Indigenous communities, to the state, and for us to follow.
Thank you. Now, please, Indigenous communities, what is your answer to this question?
Okay, said agreement supposedly gave recognition to the rights of indigenous people to self-government and autonomy. Due to the lack of response for the government and after the systematic ignorance of the San Andres Agreement, alleged response that will change the reality of our indigenous people, we were forced to assert our rights in our own hands, in which the people rule and the government obeys. Therefore, we have created a system where the people are heard and respected, and the government covers the priority needs of its people. After the uprising of Caracoles and internal youth government boards of the EZLN, we are tired of the situation of the supposed government that does nothing to deplore its actions in front of the indigenous people. We simply seek the defense of collective and individual rights that have been historically denied to Mexican indigenous people.
I'd also like to add that regarding the areas for change or improvement, one significant area should be the effective implementation of the agreement. While recognition is essential, translating these provisions into conclusions and policies is crucial. Also, there should be a stronger focus on ensuring that education in indigenous communities genuinely respects and promotes cultural diversity. These should include providing adequate resources for preserving languages and traditions, for example, and involving indigenous communities in curriculum development.
Thank you. Please, we go with the United Nations.
Thank you. We from the United Nations are very much in line, especially what the Mexican state has elaborated on, that implementation of the agreements are lacking. They're not fully implemented, and many of the promises that were made are not kept. And we want this to be seen in order to fulfill the protection of the indigenous people. And we would also even go a step further than what the Mexican state has elaborated on, and also want to see more communal rights. So that is what we would change about the agreements, that the indigenous people in reality have more rights to land and to other natural resources than it has been in reality. However, we agree also with what my counterparts from the indigenous people have said, that the recognition of indigenous autonomy has definitely occurred, and it has been a commitment to peaceful resolutions.
Thank you all for your opinions. Now I'm gonna go with the next question, and it's basically the most important one. Please, how can a modern state be created taking into account and integrating cultural diversity while simultaneously recognizing equality and equity? Please, I'll start with the indigenous communities?
Sure. Based on what all parts have said, we identify key steps for this part. First, the state must officially recognize and protect the rights of indigenous communities, backed by strong legal frameworks. Second, education should be culturally sensitive and inclusive, preserving indigenous languages and traditions while ensuring equal access. Also, facilitate ongoing, meaningful dialogue between the state and indigenous communities fosters trust and cooperation. Recognizing and supporting indigenous autonomous initiatives empowers communities within legal bounds. And very important, accountability, transparency, and international commitments are vital.
Okay, please, we'll continue with the Mexican state.
So I think modern state in a culturally diverse, equal and equitable way would look like creating a framework that leads to a modern equivalent of a decolonized state. So I imagine that would look something like a set of laws that work towards land back. Some international examples of what that has looked like is in Australia, some previous national parks or things like that. Joint committees have been set up with the Indigenous communities of that land and the government for dialogue for the Indigenous communities to run the maintenance and care of that land, so it belongs to them, and the government supports them in funding. And that is a gradual process of handing back the responsibility and the ownership of the land that's been stolen. So I think systems like that are working towards land back, but with the understanding that we're in a context of the impacts of colonization and dispossession. So giving the land back and then not offering financial support isn't a viable solution. So that's one thing. And I also think the EZLN have set up a really incredible example of a model of what a modern state could look like, which is having Indigenous groups self-governing and hopefully, as we move forwards, setting up a dialogue and a cooperation with the Mexican government, who is the aggressor in this situation, that allows communication between the self-governing groups and the government, the overarching government. And so instead of the overarching government being the one that's in control, it acting as a facilitator to distribute funds and create coherency across the different self-governing Indigenous nations in the land. That is my idea. Again, the Mexican state would like to say that any modern state on a colonized land should be directed and driven by the self-determination and the autonomy of the First Nations people. And I think, as we've seen historically in many colonized nations, that the non-Indigenous people would benefit greatly from the prioritization of caring for the land more by returning it to its rightful owners, and that communities tend to be happier and healthier when many Indigenous practices of community care and environmental care are followed. So I think that this path would also benefit the non-Indigenous people living in this country.
Thank you. We'll go on with the United Nations. Thank you for your apportation. Next Wednesday, please.
Yeah, we agree from the United Nations that the Mexican state has the monopoly of power to find a cultural policy and multicultural collaboration in order to realize the various human rights that have been, diminished in the conflict from the indigenous people. The indigenous people in Mexico are in the right to exist freely, to exist according to their human rights, and the Mexican state has to be forced, has to be pushed to realize that right for them to to realize the better living standards and more human rights for them. And we would also take a step further from the United Nations to urge the Mexican state to to realize this, because it's not only a conflict for the Mexican state itself, but also other countries, especially other indigenous communities in Latin America, are watching and perceiving this conflict as a turning point. So the Mexican state, we want to urge you to know that you are watched and that whatever you do is impactful. Thank you.
Thank you all for participating in this intercultural dialogue. I hope that our ideas and our agreements can affect furthermore in the future, and also that we as a community can emphasize and can think first about the people and the indigenous communities, and also about how a state can be or should act. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.